Hello, welcome back to the latest We Are Sunderland briefing with myself, Dom Shaw, and we're delighted to be joined by our guest columnist, James Hunter. We'll discuss all things Sunderland shortly. Do subscribe if you're watching on YouTube and you haven't already. And if you're listening on your podcast platforms, then rate and review on there. Thanks, as ever, to our partners, Cost Specs Opticians and the Fans Museum in Sunderland. And the fans, James, will be concerned this morning because fresh reports of Ipswich's bid for Jack Clarke. I say fresh reports. This is the first bid Sunderland have actually received for Clarke this summer, for all has been uncertainty over his situation all summer. It's understood to be in the region of £15 million before add-ons. As things stand, as we talk, and I'm aware that by the time you watch or listen to this, it might have changed. So apologies, because these things do develop and change so quickly at this stage of a window. But there's been no indication at this stage as to how Sunderland have responded. Talks are ongoing. First things first, James, just your general reaction.
I think it's probably been something that Sunderland fans have been expecting. Probably been expecting all summer, waiting for this. They knew that somebody somewhere would test the club's resolve to hang on to Jack Clarke. It seems to have come from Ipswich, obviously one of the newly promoted sides. The question is how Sunderland are going to respond to that. I think that £15 million, even plus some add-ons, will fall well below Sunderland's valuation of Jack Clarke. But just because Sunderland value him at whatever it might be, doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get that, of course. But I would imagine that the opening gambit is 15 million plus add-ons. Sunderland will want more than that. And we'll have to wait and see what their formal response is. It's interesting that the club haven't, you wouldn't expect the club to say anything formally about this, but it suits the club to have the figure out there and for the speculation, because if Jack Clarke does move on, then, the hair is now running and it'll be up to see and smoke out whatever other interests there might be from other clubs in the Premier League.
Yeah, Regis Labrise is speaking to the media up at the Academy of Light this afternoon. It's a tricky one, isn't it? In a situation like this, I would imagine all he'll do is outline kind of Clarke's importance as things stand and how he has faith in his entire squad, as he has done from the start. But we'll see on that. You kind of touched on it there, but this is Ipswich's opening bid, and even if it's rejected, that they're unlikely to accept defeat with that, isn't there? This isn't how these things work, and this is now likely to run, unless it comes to a swift conclusion, which I suspect it won't. It's now likely to run until late in the window, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Even if Jack Clarke ultimately ends up staying at Sunderland, you would expect this to be the first of several bids, possibly involving more clubs between now and the end of the window. So I think it's going to be one of those strap yourselves in scenarios. But I think that that Sunderland will have expected some interest in Jack Clarke. They will have been ready for this. They'll have already had a figure in mind that they will be prepared to accept for Jack. And you would assume that that the later in the window things come, the higher that figure has to be, because you'd have to try and replace him. I think that's the big issue for Sunderland. At the moment, they're trying to bring players in to strengthen the squad that they've got. If you lose Jack Clarke, suddenly you're not only having to try and strengthen the squad, but you're having to try and replace a key member. Maybe even arguably the key member of your squad. Certainly the one proven goal scorer that you've got, and that's not easy. And as we've seen from Sunderland's problems last summer, finding established goal scorers is not easy. And up to this point, Sunderland haven't brought in another goal scorer. So to lose a Jack Clarke, who probably brings you 10, 15 goals, you could probably count on him getting, to lose that kind of contribution will be a huge blow to Regis Labrise. And he will know that, and Sunderland fans can see that.
We'll come to potential replacements if it gets to that shortly. But just a final one on the Ipswich bid. That Southampton were kind of linked early in the summer, and they like him. That there's no secret there. Leeds have been linked in recent weeks, although that's felt a little bit more speculatory rather than anything concrete. They're about to sign a winger. Will they have the financial clout to sign Clarke on top of that. I know they've just sold Rudder to Brighton, but you've got to remember that this is a team in the second season in the Championship as well, and having to adjust to the financial realities that brings. But an opening offer from a club could smoke another club out, couldn't it? There'll be no doubt other clubs kind of monitoring developments here with a view on potentially making a move themselves.
Yeah, and that's what Sunderland will be hoping for. They want to try and, if they do lose Jack Clarke, they'll want to try and provoke a bidding war to try and get the best possible price. And why wouldn't you do that? The big question that none of us really know. I mean, we get signals and we hear from Jack Clarke's agent, but the big thing that we don't know is what Jack Clarke's response to this is. If he is keen to go, then of course that changes everything. There's no indication that he's keen to go. He says he's happy, and that's the indication we get. But obviously that would change the dynamic hugely if he was pushing to go behind the scenes. We'll have to wait and see on that one. That's something that often changes towards the end of the window, if there's some kind of deadlock and bids aren't being accepted. It's interesting to see from Sunderland's point of view, the clubs that are reportedly interested. You've mentioned Southampton, you've mentioned Leeds. I think that Jack Clarke would really only want to move into the Premier League. I don't think that a sideways move to Leeds in the Championship, albeit a team that were in the Premier League very recently, I doubt that would hold the same value to him as a chance at moving to a Premier League club. Of course, all three of those sides, Ipswich, Southampton and Leeds, can offer more money than Sunderland. There's no doubt about that. Obviously, Leeds having been in the Premier League just a couple of years ago, and Southampton and Ipswich currently there. And obviously, there's also Burnley to factor into this, who have been long-time admirers of Jack Clarke as well. I mean, do they still hold any interest in him? So yeah, there's a lot to think about here, and I think that the club's going to have to come to some pretty big decisions. There's been contract talks ongoing for a long time. That's another thing. That doesn't seem to have progressed at all. Does that give us a signal about what might happen next?
Yeah, Clarke's obviously in the last 2 years of his contract. There's never been an indication really that talks over an extension were close to a breakthrough. And from what we gather, those talks have kind of been put on the back burner this summer, or certainly in recent weeks and months, just because you've got the uncertainty of the transfer window, the season starting. If Clarke was still a Sunderland player after the transfer window has closed, then you would expect them to potentially reapproach those talks. But as I say, there's been no indication that there be an agreement reached on that. You kind of touched on replacements. Now, Romain Mundle has shown flashes in pre-season and the start of the season. He was excellent at Bradford in pre-season. He was one of the few players to catch the eye slightly in the Carabao Cup defeat at Preston. And Regis Lebris only talked last week about how he's experimented with Mundle on the right and as a number 10, because the reality is, if Clarke is a Sunderland player, Mundle's game time on that side of the pitch is going to be hard to come by. If Clarke was moving on, can Mundle step up and replace him? Are the options there? Pavetta can play across the forward line. We've seen Bar play on both flanks. Are the options there, or would Sunderland have to go out and bring in someone else before the deadline?
Well, it's a really tricky question, to be honest with you, Dom. I mean, as you say, we've seen flashes from Romain Mundle. At times he's looked the part, hasn't he? He's looked really good, but we haven't seen anything on a consistent basis. But to be fair to Mundle, he hasn't been playing consistently. He's not been starting games consistently, so he hasn't had those kind of opportunities. Ian Pavetta, we've seen nothing of yet. He's yet to figure in the first team. He's still in the very early stages, so we don't really know his full capabilities yet. What we do know is that Jack Clarke is at Championship level, an established top level performer who produces consistently week in, week out. He starts games, he causes problems. that is not easy to replace. That's a really tough tough ask to replace that from Sunderland's point of view, and we don't really know whether the players they've brought in are going to be able to step up if they get a sudden, £20 million, let's say, windfall for Jack Clarke. What do they do with that money? Do they say, well, it's too late in the window now, let's hang on till January and think about then? Well, there's a logic to that, but I don't think fans would accept that. I think fans would not see the value of having £20 million burning a hole in your pocket between now and January, having just lost your one established goal scorer. I think they would have to look for a replacement. And in my opinion, as I've said so many times over Sunderland looking to bring in fresh players, it would have to be an established player capable of going straight into the first team and delivering now, not somebody who might come good in 2.5 years' time. I don't think Sunderland have that kind of patience. Patience isn't the word. I think Sunderland need to be in more of a hurry than that.
And yet your problem is, if you were to sell Clarke and go out and sign an established player, as you're talking about there, well, selling clubs know you've got however much money burning a hole in your pocket, and you're in desperate need of replacing your best player and potentially the best player in the Championship, which makes life incredibly difficult, doesn't it?
It does. It's usually difficult, and it's that age-old dilemma. As soon as a club knows that you've got money and they know that you need somebody, the price goes up, doesn't it? And this is where there's so many different dynamics with a transfer window, and players become unsettled. I mean, that will be the thing looking this weekend. Will Jack Clarke play against Burnley? If he does, it's a story. If he doesn't, it's a story. It's a huge. It's now, it has set the hair running, and everybody's going to be talking about this. And Sunderland would be in the same situation if they were chasing a replacement for Jack Clarke. If that became public, then we'd have to see the reaction to that too.
And it comes on the back of a Sheffield Wednesday win, in which Sunderland were excellent across the board, and several players were outstanding, and we'll touch on them. But Clarke was one of them, wasn't he? And he showed in that game just how dangerous he is, how much of a weapon he is, how much of a nightmare he is to play against. And if you're a club watching that game that's interested in Clarke, then it's certainly not going to put you off him, is it? How far you?
Of course no. And it was interesting to hear Danny Rowell say afterwards, the Sheffield Wednesday coach, that he said that one way or another, he thinks Jack Clarke will wind up playing at the top level. And here we are, less than a week on, discussing a club giving Jack Clarke the opportunity to do just that. Things move quickly. It would be very difficult to replace Jack Clarke. We've seen his value last year. In particular, and again at the start of the current season, he's been hugely impressive, as has Sunderland's start to the season. And the last thing anybody wants to see right now is anything happen to disrupt that and take some of the wind out of their sails.
And here we are, almost 14 minutes in to a Sunderland briefing, and we haven't yet talked about centre forwards and strikers, which you can tell that. Well, either we're on the back of an emphatic result or there's dramatic developments elsewhere, both in this case. Eliza Mayenda scored an excellent brace against Sheffield Wednesday. Then a couple of days later, there's news that Sunderland are closing in on the signing of Wilson Isidor. Apologies if I've got that pronunciation all wrong. We should soon find out whether I've got it all wrong, because all the indications are that he's going to be a Sunderland player. That earlier this week, Sunderland were kind of closing in at that stage, sources told us, and Zenit's chairman said that Isidor is on his way to Sunderland, which is pretty concrete, isn't it? Again, we'll ask Labrice about that on Thursday afternoon. A few points on this, really. Mayenda, excellent, showed that there's definitely something there, but it doesn't change the fact that he clearly needs help. You can't rely on a young lad at this stage of his development being Sunderland's only striking outlet this season. Isidor's positive, although we don't know a lot about him. It's positive because Sunderland clearly need to bring someone in. And I guess the question on the back of that is, will he be the only one? Will there be more? The Alexandra Mendy situation's ongoing. Only hours before the Isidor news broke, Mendy's agent came out and again reiterated Mendy's desire to join Sunderland. So the indications aren't that that one's dead in the water. But yeah, despite Mayenda's goals on Sunday, despite the transfer developments, there's still a lot of unanswered questions, bizarrely, isn't there?
There are, and it's so. I seem to have been writing about strikers in Sunderland for what seems to be forever. It just gets, you get to the point where you're saying the same things again and again. I mean, here we are with Elijah Mayenda, who had an excellent game at the weekend against Sheffield Wednesday. Finally, got his goals, got off the mark, and is up and running, and that's brilliant, and that was great to see. And hopefully, he'll go on from there and get further goals and come to establish himself in the team. But we don't know that yet. They say, one swallow doesn't make a summer. We don't know yet whether that was a sign of things to come, or whether that was, just I don't want to say flash in the pan, but it was a one-off. We don't know. Hopefully not. I know that back when the strikers Hamir and Mason Burstow and Elijah Mayenda and Rusin all joined last summer, I know that of those strikers, Tony Mowbray's feeling was certainly that Mayenda was the one that was most likely to succeed in the long term. Now, Mayenda went out for a loan spell, didn't really do anything there up in Scotland last season. But he's come back to Sunderland. He started games at the beginning of the season, and he's got those 2 goals against Sheffield Wednesday, and that's great. But as you've mentioned, he's only a young lad still. You can't rely on him to lead the line for an entire season in the Championship. He is going to need help. To what extent he'll get that from Nazir Rusin, I'm not sure. It looks like Lewis Hamir is not somebody that Regis Labrie particularly fancies. There's Wilson Isidor. Now, I don't know, I certainly don't know anything about Wilson Isidor before he became linked with Sunderland. He wasn't a name that was familiar to me. So again, he would be another striker that Sunderland will be taking a punt on, basically. Now, they will say to you, well, taking a punt is not really right. We research these things. We've got, but to people who are not deep dive into the statistics every single week of football leagues across Europe, as far as fans are concerned, as far as journalists are concerned that cover Sunderland, they'd be taking a punt. And same with Alexandra Mendy if he came. Of course, the agent's getting involved with Mendy saying he wants to come to Sunderland. Well, if the boy's keen to come and Sunderland want him, then you have to ask, well, where's the hold up? It can only be over money and transfer fees. But yeah, I think Sunderland are going to have to bring in more firepower. We know that that's what's let them down so badly last season, and now we've got the added complication that if Jack Clarke does move on, that leaves another gap. And it will increase the urgency of the situation. And
you mentioned they're taking a punt, and I take your point that for those in the recruitment team, for those involved, they'd say, well, we've looked at X, Y, and Z, and this is why it isn't. And yet, even if all the metrics point to the fact that whatever player is going to be a success, there's still the unknowns of how will he settle in the Championship, how will the player settle in the area, as we've seen with Naz Rusin, and these things. There's always an element of the unknown with, isn't there? And I think we've seen with Poveda, for example, we still haven't seen Poveda in a Sunderland shirt. And how many weeks has he been a Sunderland player now? 4. Which tells you that if a centre forward comes in, particularly if it's Mendy, I say if a centre forward comes in, obviously all the indications are Isidor's going to, but if Mendy follows, for example, hasn't played any football in pre-season, hasn't been training with the first team. It's the same with Isidor. He's coming from Russia. There's going to be, however long he's going to require to settle, to get up to speed, for Labrie to think he's ready to play. So with all that in mind, it's going to help an awful lot if Mayenda is able to kick on from Sunday's performance and goals.
Yeah, of course. As you mentioned, when you're bringing in players from other leagues around Europe, you've got everything to consider, from language barriers to the moving of families over here, getting to know your new teammates. You've got to get up to speed, to fit in with the plan that the head coach is playing, and get to come to terms with the championship as well, of course. So there's so many factors involved. It's not just a case as if you were buying a player from an Ipswich Town or this club or that club in England, where you know that most of those hurdles have already been overcome. You're bringing somebody in from outside, and that takes time. And as I say, I'm probably being unnecessarily disparaging to the recruitment team by saying taking a punt. They'll say, well, there's solid. They'll say there's data to back these things up, but then they'll also say, well, there was data to back up Lewis Hamir, and data to back up other signings that haven't worked and players that have moved on. Data to back up Mason Bursall last year. So data is a part of the mix, but it can't. It can never be foolproof. It can be a guide, but it can be no guarantee of a success. And the stakes are so high for Sunderland and for the football department at the club now. Stakes are so high because of the failures last year in terms of strikers that I think that they'd be better off adopting a safety first approach, i.e. spending a bit more and bringing somebody in that going down the path that they went. I know obviously the individual isn't going to be there, but the kind of model that they tried to do in January, where they tried to bring in Kiefer Moore. There you've got a player who was at home in the Championship and was established and a proven goal scorer. That would be the kind of area that I would be focusing on, rather than bringing in players from Europe and hoping that they fit the bill. I see the attraction in it, of course, the cost wise and fitting the club's model and the rest of it. I see the attraction of doing that, but at the moment, I think that the mood is such that they can't afford any more failures.
You mentioned data there. There was no data required to tell us how good Chris Rigg was on Sunday against Sheffield Wednesday. There's been several already, but was that his best display in a Sunderland shirt yet?
I'd certainly say it was right up there. I'm struggling to think of a better one. There have been games where he's got more attention because he's been, introduced as the club's youngest player or the youngest goal scorer or whatever. But I think in terms of, his maturity and evident increasing experience as time moves on, I think that was as good as he's been for Sunderland, and it shows what a real talent he is, and to the club's credit, how well they did to tie him down to a new contract in the summer when he was one of the players that were being eyed by clubs elsewhere.
Burnley this weekend on the back of that is already looking like the acid test, really, isn't it? 2 games in. I think the 3 teams that came down, there was a fair bit more uncertainty this time around, which we've talked about at length over the summer compared to last year, when the kind of indications or the feeling was they were all going to be incredibly strong. And so it proved, really. Obviously, 2 of the 3 going straight back up. Burnley, Luton and Sheffield United wasn't so clear. Things happening off the pitch, takeovers, manager changes and whatnot. And yet Burnley under Scott Parker have started, emphatically doesn't really come close, does it? It's going to be the first true test. Now, that feels harsh because before last weekend, I'd seen plenty of people, including my colleague Scott Wilson, talking up Sheffield Wednesday as top 6 contenders. And I still think they'll absolutely be up there certainly in the top half, top 10, and certainly in contention. Danny Rowell admitted afterwards, didn't he, on Sunday, that was just one of those days. But there's no doubt in whatsoever that this is going to be Sunderland's toughest test so far, and one of the toughest tests they're likely to face all season.
Are you calling it a promotion decider, Dom? Is that what you're saying?
Is it too early? Is it too early for a 6-pointer? Probably just. Even by our standards, or even by my incredibly low standards, I think it probably is.
No, I think you're right. It is a real test for Sunderland. This one, Cardiff. I think looking back and looking at the subsequent result, I think Cardiff have not started well and have been no great shakes. I think Sheffield Wednesday, they had a good start, didn't they? They had an emphatic win against Plymouth. So for Sunderland to then turn them over in style, that was an impressive result. But Burnley have started like an express train. I know 2 wins out of 2, same as Sunderland, but they've looked very powerful and straight away on course for another automatic promotion, just as they did two seasons ago. Of course, when Sunderland played Burnley in that game, they played Burnley off the park at the stadium of like 2 years ago. We're 2-0 up at half time, and it was only in the second half when Vincent Kompany made a few changes and Burnley really sort of started firing in the second half that they turned that round and came back to win. But Sunderland have shown that they are capable of playing against a very solid Burnley team. That said, this is going to be as you said, an acid test. It's going to be a sign for Sunderland fans of whether the season so far, the two wins out of 2 against Cardiff and Sheffield Wednesday, whether that's been a real accurate reflection of where Sunderland are at, or whether it's been a bit of a false dawn. I think that said, Sunderland could lose against Burnley on Saturday, and that doesn't mean that Sunderland have made a poor start. They would then have lost against one of the strongest, if not the strongest team in the Championship. So it wouldn't be a disaster. Obviously, there's the manner of your defeat, if that's how it turns out to be. Obviously, if you get turned over, then that's one thing. Hopefully that won't happen, and hopefully Sunderland can go on and win and make it 3 wins out of 3. But yeah, I don't think it's a given that that if Sunderland were to lose on Saturday, that means everything that we've seen so far has been false and led us to believe one thing when in fact something else is in fact the case. It is going to be difficult to compete with Burnley. It's difficult to compete with a team that has been in the Premier League, has been competing at that top level as recently as they have. And so, I think we'll have a better idea for Sunderland's start of the season after Saturday.
And we'll be back next week to look back on that game, to look back on hopefully another positive result, and to look ahead to the final days of the transfer window. How will they play out? How will the Jack Clarke situation stand then? Will there be a striker through the door? Still plenty of unanswered questions as we approach the last week. Thanks for joining us, James. James's weekly column will be available on We Are Sunderland first thing Friday morning. We'll have all the latest of the Jack Clarke developments on there, and we'll hear from Regis Labrise this afternoon. As I said at the start, do subscribe if you haven't already on YouTube, and rate and review if you're listening on your podcast channels. And a thanks again to our partners, Cospex Opticians and the Fans Museum. Enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy Saturday, hopefully as much as you did last Sunday. And we'll be back next week for our latest We Are Sunderland briefing. Take care.